Manchester United are one of the biggest clubs in the world, but they don't really play like it. Why is that? In today's episode, presented by StatHead, I'm joined by JJ Bull and Jon Mackenzie. So JJ, some people hold Ten Hag responsible for their underwhelming form. Is that fair?
Well, let's look at some of the numbers to work out whether he is good or not and whether they should keep him. For example, Man United, one of the biggest clubs in the world, are currently a team fighting for 6th place in the league with a goal difference of 0. And the underlying numbers suggest this should actually be -4. This is bad. They've actually scored the same number of goals this season as Luton. And that's a big drop off from 3rd place last season when they actually looked half decent. But they won the League Cup and reached the FA Cup final last season, and they're in the FA Cup semi-final this season, so that's good. But they finished bottom of their Champions League group this season. This is bad. Now, the numbers get more bad if you dig in using StatHead. So if you look at this, what you can do is go through the 2 seasons that Ten Hag's been at United, and what you see if you do that is that they are 17th out of the top 5 leagues for points per match. That doesn't sound that bad really, but it means they're basically the same as Aston Villa and Lazio. And even worse, again on StatHead, you can see their goals scored puts them 35th in the top 5 leagues for goals scored. This is Manchester United we're talking about.
It is Manchester United we're talking about, and what are some of their other issues?
Well, because they're Man United, you think they're a massive team, so they should have lots of the ball, but they actually only have about 50.4% of possession, which kind of tells you they're not really an attacking team nor a defensive one. They're kind of in between. They're a bit kind of hard to understand what they are. And they concede an awful lot of shots. And to get this good, Erik Ten Hag has spent roughly £380 million of real money to bring in players. So that's what you get. Now, if you look through lots of other stats, and there are an awful lot more, you'll find things that make them look far worse, like underlying numbers especially. And you can do that by looking through seasons on StatHead, for example. And if you go to the link in the description, well, do you know what you'll find?
A personalised discount?
That's correct, and then you can look for things on StatHead yourself.
So you mentioned how much money they spent. Did they get any value for that expenditure?
Well, these are the players that they kind of have. This is the squad that they have, as you can see on the board now. And this is what Ten Hag has built. He's brought in these players. He's brought in Mount and Martinez and Anthony and all these kind of lads here. But one thing you should bear in mind when you look at Man United this season is that these players, the key players that they've signed, have been missing for most of the season. Mount's been out injured. Martinez has been out injured. Shaw's been out injured for most of the season as well. Rashford's been out of form. Casemiro's not been anywhere near his best. Varane's missed a lot of the season, and Anthony's also not been around for some of it as well. So you're missing your key group of players, so it's kind of inconsistent. And Ten Hag has had to adapt constantly throughout his Man United career. Like his first 2 games in charge of the team, where I think he lost 2-1 to Brighton and he lost 4-0 to Brentford. And he was trying to play out from the back, like trying to pass it with all these guys from the back, but they were getting humiliated and turning over the ball and getting done in, basically. So he abandoned that style of play, the possession-based thing he wanted to do. And what's interesting about it to me is that Ten Hag's had to adapt constantly, but when he joined, he wanted to play a certain way, the kind of possession style of play, and he said that he didn't have the players to do that, so he couldn't play the way he wanted to, and so then he's transitioned naturally to more of a direct attacking kind of style of play. So what you end up getting with Man United now is that they'll play this kind of shape. This is just a rough bunch of players. Let's put Man Utd in because he's been great recently. So put them in here. So what you get, the front 3 stay very high like this, the front 3 like this. And what they want to do is try and get the ball in behind the back line so that they can attack the space. It's kind of traditional Man United style of play, lots of wing play, lots of direct attacks. And so when they win the ball, they try and get it forward as quickly as they can, and so these guys can then attack. But to do that, you want to try and bring this back line forward to create more space in behind. And so when they're trying to play with the ball, they'll often push some of these guys up, and you might get something like this. And this guy will join in here. Maybe Casemiro will push up. But what you do is you create a big gap between this line and the midfield. So sometimes you'll have one person isolated here. So when they lose the ball and the opposition team attacks, we'll just put an extra player in here, they can run into all this space. This happens quite a lot, and it doesn't look ideal for what Man United are trying to do. But this is created by them playing players who are further up the pitch, but they have a deeper line. Normally you want them to be more compact like this, but they don't do it regularly. And like he says in the past that they're meant to be more compact, but yet this happens every single time. It must be on purpose.
Yeah, it's hard to know why they're doing this. And this isn't just an issue in possession, it's an issue out of possession as well, because Manchester United, as you've said, they're trying to generate chances through opening up space in the opposition's half that they can then attack. The more space you create, the easier it is to attack. You have players like Garnacho, Højlund, Fernandes, Rashford. Those are really good transitional players, so they're going to be able to hit that space and cause a huge amount of problems. So one way you do it, as you said, is in possession, get the ball forward as quickly as possible into space that you've created. But the other way that they've been doing it, particularly last season, was by having a really aggressive counter press and trying to win the ball high up the field and then again generate those chaotic scenarios where you've created space that you can then attack as well. And what we see Manchester United doing this season in particular is playing out of a 4-4-2 shape and just being really aggressive in their press, and often their midfielders will end up stepping forward as well. And then you end up again with these big gaps in between the back line and the front line. And most elite teams, if they're playing a really aggressive counter press, are going to push that line up, as you said, because it reduces the amount of space that you need to cover. It does leave a lot of space in behind, which is quite scary if you're a slower defender. And I guess part of the problem for Manchester United this season has been their defenders have not been their ideal starting 11 defenders.
Yeah.
And so you've got players like Johnny Evans or Harry Maguire, who is a quick player but has a slow turning circle, and so actually that line drops a little bit deeper, and then suddenly you end up with this massive disparity between the front line and the back line, and teams are just playing through the Manchester United press into that space and then just running directly at the back line, and it's just been chaos.
Some of the things they do are on purpose to try and create these transitional moments. And so what they might do, for example, is what we're trying to do is draw this line. We're going to pull this up a little bit to create more space in behind so you can get runners in behind. So what they'll sometimes do are make third man runs. You'll see them like a centre back might ping it up to a forward, like Højlund, who'll then lay it back first time. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're putting the ball up to here, it draws the defenders close to them, which creates that gap in behind. By playing that over the top, Rashford will hit first time ball over the top for someone to run in behind. So you'll see that quite a lot. It's all about creating those transitional moments. That's what Ten Hag wants to do, try and make them really good, well not good, but like transitional, and create moments where they can run in behind and play more of the traditional Man United way. But the problem is they turn over the ball a lot, and because of the way they're pushing up, like me and John have discussed, it then leaves them vulnerable to counterattacks, and they're getting loads of teams running straight at them.
Surely he's not instructing his defence to remain so deep while everybody else is pushing forward.
I don't know, because he says often that either the front line wasn't good enough at their press or the back line wasn't doing what he wanted them to, but it's consistent, so you see it an awful lot, and they'll train this, right? And if you are a player like Johnny Evans, Harry Maguire, maybe you don't want to push up as high as that. That's the thing. So everyone else has to stay in line with you. Everyone's in charge of that. So you can't leave one person back. So, I mean, what you see now is some of the fullbacks move into the midfield. You said Dalot started doing that recently as well, just to try and clog the middle of the pitch. But they leave this gap every single time. And it means that when the teams do run at them, often they just block the middle. When you're playing five-a-side, it's quite hard to score if you're blocking the middle like this. So if you're running at this, it might look like a huge advantage, like a 4v4 or 5v4 or something like that. But actually, it's still quite difficult to score because they just block you, they slow you down, show the ball wide. You kind of have to move it wide because that's where the space is, because they block the middle, and then move slow down. And so although they concede a lot of chances are kind of low value. They conceded some goals doing this, but they might just end up with a team taking a shot from here, which is saved usually or goes wide.
It's an interesting point though, because I think a lot has been made of the fact that I think Manchester United have the third lowest expected goals per shot against. So when teams are taking shots against them, they're the third lowest. It's 0.1, I think, XG per shot. And a lot's been made of the fact that that's the third lowest, and you would say, well, the lower the chance, then you're doing something right. But actually, the spread of those values is really small. And I think the league average is 0.11, which is like very minimally like higher than 0.1.
A hundredth of an expected goal, so better than the average.
Yeah, it may be the case that this is slowing things down, making the shots harder. But I think because they're conceding, I mean, there was one point a couple of weeks ago where they conceded something like 100 shots in 5 games or so. And at that point, Manchester City had conceded like just over 200 in the whole season. So the volume is what's killing them here, because even at the Premier League level, even if you're conceding like slightly lower value chances, I think just the aggregation of those will mean that you will concede goals. That's just the nature of Premier League football.
And there'll be players that are so good, they just ping one in from 30 yards, like Foden for something,
Well, I was going to say, a lot of those shots were probably against Manchester City, to be fair.
That's true.
So, as you've both mentioned, Ten Hag wants Man United to be the most transitional team, or the best transitional team in the world. You think that means the most. That's not really what most elite teams do. You think of Arsenal and Man City and Liverpool in the Premier League, and even like Bayern Munich and PSG. Nobody really plays like that at the very top level. So what do the elite teams do that United should be aspiring to do as well?
Yeah, I think the thing with the elite teams is that they need to be able to control games in almost every phase. You're not going to be able to challenge for a title if you're not able to actually control different phases of play. Now, we've talked about what Manchester United are trying to do in possession. That's get the ball forward quickly. If they lose the ball, then the idea is that you counter-press, which means just try and win the ball back as quickly as possible, because as we've said, if you don't do that, you're exposed. You've got that big space in behind. And that the idea is that Manchester United will say, well, that's fine. If we can get our counter-press going well, that's a risk that we're willing to take. So we attack directly, we win, counter-press, win the ball back, and that might even generate attacking chances for us as well. That worked fine last season. The problem is that this season the counter-press hasn't been working, and it just means that Manchester United aren't able to control games in those phases. So what's happening is the ball's going forward and then coming straight back at them. And you get lots of turnovers of possession, which means that you're not only are you not getting as many good chances away, but you're also conceding a lot more as well. It goes backwards and forwards. And the problem is that, yes, if you're a team like Manchester United, we've already talked about how they've got these 4 players who are really good in transitional moments. The problem is that if you make the games super transitional, sometimes you're going to lose games because in the Premier League, the oppositions have got strikers and forwards who are going to be able to hurt you as well.
So you mentioned that it's not working as well, the counter-press this season, as it was last season. Is there a specific reason for that, like personnel-wise? Because they seem to have, at least on paper, improved the squad.
Yeah, I mean, you can point to certain things, I think, in terms of what's changed this season on last season. One of them is that Casemiro has not been quite so good out of possession. And obviously, if you're the remaining central midfielder, when the opposition are attacking, you can cover that space well. We've seen, for example, Declan Rice have a huge impact on Arsenal for that reason. Then it affords your counter-press a little bit more cover as well. They have changed the way that they're counter-pressing. I think as well, teams have just figured out the way that they press and found ways of building through it as well,
right,
which has made it less efficient as well. And again, Premier League football, you're now coming up against teams at the bottom half of the table who have centre-backs who can build up through presses, even if they're really good presses. And so there's questions about whether or not this style of play is functional enough for a really elite team, because you are just leaving it up to chance. If you're saying we're going to have the ball coming backwards and forwards all the time, lots of turnovers of possession, actually we're not really controlling the game well enough in those moments where we have the ball, because what you want, I think, as an elite team is to recognise that sometimes you can defend with the ball as well as without the ball. You don't want to just give the opposition the ball and say, come at us and we'll try and defend it. You want to say, we're going to keep the ball as long as possible. Maybe we won't always score in those moments, but we will generally be able to control games. And that's what the really elite teams do.
So Manchester City are probably the best example of an elite team who control games really well, right? They've got Pep Guardiola, of course, that's what they do. But how exactly do they do that?
Yeah, so what I think Manchester City are trying to do is with the ball, they're going to try and control the play in the final third as much as possible. So what we're going to actually do is talk about a number of different attempts to control the games from elite teams, and we're going to look at different parts of the field where they're controlling. So Manchester City, it's all about controlling the ball in the opposition's final third. And like when you've watched Manchester City play enough, you know what they do is they squeeze oppositions right back, they possess the ball, they make sure that they are able to retain possession, moving it down the field. They don't want to do anything that's too high risk because they want to keep the ball. And what they end up then doing is just absolutely squeezing the opposition into the final third like this. But what they're trying to do is not only score goals by being around the opposition's penalty area, they're actually trying to control this phase of the game. They want to keep the ball as long as possible, make it hard for the opposition to score. If you keep the ball in this area, you're miles away from your own goal. So even if the teams that you're playing against win the ball back, they're going to have to move a huge amount of distance to actually cause you any problems.
That's far from the goal. Yeah.
That is far from the goal. So you'll often see Manchester City in this sort of setup. Now,
can I just point out that L8 and R8 means left 8 and right 8?
You can.
Just for anyone who wasn't sure.
Yeah. To do this, you need to have a couple of things. One thing that you need to do is you need to have really technical players, because as you can see, what you've done is you've reduced the playing area into a really small space. And what's going to happen is the opposition are just going to block out their penalty area. It's going to be hard to find the space to generate chances, right? So often Man City will play for ages and ages and ages, and what they're doing is moving the ball side to side, trying to find that weakness to just play the ball into and then score. You need really technical players to do this. The other thing that you need is a really good rest defensive structure. Now, what we mean by rest defense is, in this scenario, as you can see, if the ball is turned over, there's a huge amount of space that can be attacked. And what we mean by rest defense is the structure that you take up in possession. So Manchester City attacking here. In the event that they lose the ball, how are they structured then to be able to defend this space? So, you know, we see, usually for Man City, you've got Rodri, you've got often the outside, the centre-backs or the full-backs coming inside to narrow the pitch. You'll have the two centre-backs here. That is designed to allow you to recycle the ball, but it's also designed to make it hard for the opposition to actually attack the space once they win the ball back.
And Stones will, of course, be quite often in that line in front to even stop it getting as far back as the centre-backs, right?
Yeah.
And then if it does, they've got rapid Kyle Walker, just in case.
Yeah, and I bring this up because, you know, this is the way that a lot of elite teams are playing. And, you know, it would be easy for me to be like, what do Manchester United need to do to control games better? They should play like Pep Guardiola's Man City. I mean, every manager wants to try and play like Pep Guardiola's Man City. This is the way that elite teams are trying to do it, and probably Manchester United will want to get to a point where they're able to control games like this, because as we've said, it's just a really good way of being able to control games. But they're not there right now. Ten Hag might argue, I don't have the players to be able to do this. I don't have the really elite technical players to be able to possess the ball in the opposition half. We've already talked about the problems that they have with the centre-backs playing a high line. This is a super high line. So he would argue...
The highest of lines in the league,
yeah,
probably,
exactly,
right?
Yeah, and he would argue that we can't really do this right now. So the question is, are there other ways of being able to control the game which don't rely on you having this kind of personnel to do it?
So what other ways are there to control games?
Yeah, so I want to talk about another team who control the ball in a very different part of the pitch, and that is Brighton, particularly Brighton last season. They've maybe changed things up a little bit this season, but you'll remember Brighton last season, everyone was talking about the way that they like to bait presses, pull opposition players forward. And so what they're trying to do here is essentially trying to control the ball in their own third. So what you do is you have these really nice build-up structures. They have all of these automatisms, so they know how to move around opposition presses, work the ball through those presses and get the ball in behind in quite transitional moments. We call them artificial transitions, because usually when you're transitioning, you've won the ball back from an opposition and then hit the space in behind. What you're doing here with artificial transitions is trying to create those same conditions, but through possession of the ball, so it's less risky.
It's a vegan counter-attack.
That's right, yeah. So essentially what you're doing then is you're attempting to pull the opposition really high up the pitch, because you've got a really sort of provocative press, I would call it, because what you're doing is you're saying, yeah, come at us. You'll see the centre-back with their foot on the ball being like, come and get it. The idea then being that you want to get as many of their players forward like this, and then have these routes to work through those lines of pressure, and then you can hit particularly the wide players in behind over the top. You're controlling the ball in your final third, you're having solutions to get through opposition presses, and then you're doing these really transitional attacks through like Karim Mitoma, we had Solly March on this side, or Simon Adingra this season as well. This is actually a really good way of being able to control the ball in a very different part of the pitch. And I think this would actually be quite a nice way for Manchester United to play, right? Because we've already talked about their front four being really good transitional
players. You see
players.
bits of this in there almost a little bit. Like this Rashford thing, like, it's one little pattern. They don't have very many patterns that you see often. Yeah. I think because like this is so coordinated and highly coached, whereas maybe the thing that Ten Hag's doing is trying to allow individual players who suit being given freedom to be individual, to do what they want when they get the ball. But then the problem with that is that when you get the ball, you don't know exactly where your teammates are, so there's no automated movements to make, and it looks disjointed, and that's where things go wrong. Yeah,
I think Manchester United's build-up under Erik ten Hag is just about trying to get the ball forward as quickly as possible, right?
So even Onana, right? So rather than playing back,
exactly.
He tends to go, where's the ball gone? He tends to put it to someone in the middle here, and then build from there to bypass the press.
Yeah, and that's all about speed and moving it forward. But again, that makes the game more transitional. It means you lose a bit of control, whereas this is super control, because it's like, you'll have long periods of games with Brighton, particularly last season, where they would just play the ball around the back. Teams would be really hesitant to step in. Brighton don't care, because they're like, well, this is a moment where we're possessing the ball, we're not having to defend, we're actually controlling the conditions of the game. So again, maybe bringing in a coach to Manchester United who could introduce some of this super automated build-up patterns and then move into these transitional moments might work for them. I guess the counter argument would be Brighton play a little bit of a different way this season because they've lost players, but also because other teams have figured out what they're doing a little bit more. So
that's the danger, right? So it looks highly automated. So you recognise exactly what it is. They've got a style, they've got an identity that people talk about. Man United don't, but Man United's identity is basically chaos rather than structure, and that's why it looks like there's nothing there.
And like you say, teams do eventually work it out, or they work out a way to counteract it. Like I think it was West Ham this season just refused to be baited by that come and press us plea from like Duncan, Webster, whoever. And I think they won 3-1 playing with actual counterattacks because Brighton lost patience and eventually went forward. And of course, the other downside to it is that it is risky when you're first doing it if you don't quite have the right players, or if you do lose the ball that deep. That's the difference between controlling the ball in the final third compared to doing this, right? Is that when you do lose the ball, you're a lot closer to your own goal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very risky way of playing. So maybe there's a third way where we're not talking about controlling it super deep and having the risk of having the turnovers if your build-up isn't good enough, or not having the personnel to be able to squeeze teams into the final third. And so I wanted to just give you an example of a team who are doing controlling the game in a very different way at the elite level. And this is Xabi Alonso's Bayer Leverkusen, because what Bayer Leverkusen are doing is a sort of halfway house between what we've got with City, which is squeezing everyone high, and Brighton, which is building up really low. And what actually they're trying to do, I would say Leverkusen is control the ball in the centre of the field now. So we've talked about the final third on either side. Now we're talking about midfield control. What Bayer Leverkusen are trying to do is they're trying to build up in the regular way that most elite teams do. So kind of control build up, getting settled possession as we call it from goal kicks, for example, which means that you've won possession of the ball after you've taken the goal kick. The opposition have dropped off a little bit. They're giving you time and space. And so what they then do is they get to this scenario where they're able to possess the ball in the middle. They're able to play it around from one side to the other. But then rather than doing what Manchester City might be trying to do, which is again move the ball down the field, squeeze the opposition deeper, reduce space, make it harder for yourself to attack. What Leverkusen are doing is they're actually getting these scenarios where they're able to overload certain parts of the pitch, in channels particularly. So maybe you've got Florian Wirtz on the left wing dropping in to help out. We have the right winger here with Frimpong coming up the pitch, able to drop inside as well. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to find these moments where they can do these really quick passing movements through the lines of pressure and then change the tempo super quickly in order to play almost like mini transitions again, with space, not making the opposition able to get really compact. And so we're sort of in a halfway house between what Brighton are doing and what Man City are doing. And the difference for me then is like Brighton are trying to build up from here, Leverkusen are trying to build up from here, and so you're reducing the amount of space you can actually attack into, but you're still leaving enough space open, unlike City, to be able to get the most of the fact that the opposition is still spread out a little bit.
In this like Goldilocks approach to tactics, what sort of trigger would they have when they have the ball to suddenly increase that tempo, like you say?
Yeah, and I guess that's the importance of the coaching here is that what we are seeing is it is a lot of passing. It's still passing around side to side to try and find those openings, but with the realization that at some point everyone is going to end up in those channels, and it's going to be a lot of third man combinations like JJ was talking about before. So player dropping in here so that he can bounce pass it around the line of pressure, and yeah, it's so good to watch because it is all about slow, patient, side-to-side stuff, and then suddenly, bang, you change the tempo, bang, 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 they're through, and they're in behind, and it's it's about trying to get the balance then between patience, but also, I guess, aggressive attacking as well, which gives you the upside of, as we've said, the space that is opened out.
So Man United aren't playing with the control that people maybe expected when Ten Hag arrived, when his reputation was sky high after his success with Ajax, but what were his Ajax team actually like? To jog our memory, here's Alex Barker.
So plenty of people thought Erik Ten Hag was the smart pick when Manchester United hired him. But with United now struggling, that feels like a distant memory. So what exactly did he do at Ajax that made him United's preferred candidate? And can re-examining this period help us better understand the situation him and the club currently find themselves in? When I say Erik Ten Hag's Ajax, you're likely picturing that famous 18-19 side, who won their first league title in 5 years and reached the Champions League knockout stages for the first time since 2006, beating Juventus and Real Madrid along the way. So, what made them so good? Well, the season in question was marked by their aggressive pressing. Ten Hag set up in a 4-2-3-1, often deploying a man-marking system. The forwards would press the opposition very high and centrally, so they're baiting this pass into the fullback, at which point Ajax would then squeeze over, forcing the opposition to kick it long. And these long balls were then easily swallowed up by the likes of Matthijs de Ligt. Ajax also had a ferocious counter-press. They won more tackles in the final third per 90 than anyone else in the Champions League, including Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool. And that led into another thing that made Ajax stand out that season, the speed they attacked with. With Frenkie de Jong, Ten Hag had a player who was a huge advantage in build-up, as he could securely carry the ball through opposition lines, which is more risky than trying to pass it forward, but when it works, it can be more disruptive to a defensive shape, as he can pull more players out of position. And from here, Ajax were blessed with a fluid group of attackers performing at a really high level that season. Now, there were some differences between how Ajax played in the league and the Champions League. As in Europe, they were more content to hold less of the ball, choosing to be a bit more pragmatic and try and limit the opposition's strengths. And perhaps that was the most impressive thing about Ten Hag in this period. Yes, he was able to dominate domestic competition, but he was also tactically flexible enough to adapt against superior opposition and get results. Now, while this was an extremely successful season, possibly Ajax's most successful in the modern era, it wasn't the 2018-19 campaign that got Ten Hag a job in the Premier League. I think what came after actually solidified Ten Hag's reputation as a top European coach. This is because that summer, Ajax lost a number of key players, and now Ten Hag faced a big problem. They couldn't attack as quickly without Frenkie de Jong's ball carrying, and they couldn't press as aggressively without Matthijs de Ligt and Lasse Schöne's physical presence. While Ajax were on course to win the 2020 Eredivisie before it got cancelled, you can see there's a large drop-off in their Champions League numbers numbers compared to the previous season, even considering it's a small sample size. And this underperformance left Ten Hag with a choice. He could try and find a way to maintain the style of play he had success with, or he could adapt his tactics to the new players he had at his disposal. Ten Hag chose the latter. Over the next couple of years, Ten Hag moved Lisandro Martinez from midfield to centre-back. He also rejigged his midfield to move it to a single pivot system. And finally, he completely reshaped his attack with the signing of Sebastian Haller. Ajax became more patient on the ball, slowly pushing more players into the final third, taking more time to create chances in the box. And this can be seen with the type of chances Haller was getting. Across his time at Ajax, over a third of his shots came with his head. And Ten Hag didn't just adapt on the ball, out of possession his team defended much more zonally. Because with the likes of Haller and an aging Daley Blind at left back, Ajax didn't have the same energy to maintain a man-to-man press. And it's fair to say, it worked. Ten Hag's final season saw Ajax concede just 19 goals, the lowest in his tenure, and they continue to enjoy relative success on the European stage, reaching the quarterfinals of the Europa League in 2021 and the round of 16 in the Champions League in 2022, after beating Dortmund 7-1 on aggregate in the group stages. So this is why Man United hired Erik ten Hag. He successfully adapted to the individuals he had at his disposal and continued to win trophies. And not only did they dominate domestically, they also showcased their ability to beat teams many would consider to be above their level.
So why hasn't Erik ten Hag been able to essentially do what he did at Ajax, as Alex has explained, at Manchester United?
Well, I think there's an argument to be made that the Erik ten Hag from Ajax was what Manchester United got. We've already talked about how Manchester United are good at getting to cup finals, which is what we saw from Erik ten Hag's Ajax. He's actually a very pragmatic coach, I would say. Even his time at Ajax shows that, and I think Alex has done a good job of showing how often what he does is he takes the players at his disposal and fits them to whatever's going on. I think there's an argument to be made that that's exactly what's happened at Manchester United as well. But, you know, Ajax obviously have a talent differential in the Eredivisie, which I think means that you can have dominance in the league. This transitional style of play, I think the big question is, can you do that in a league where you have Arsenal and Man City and Liverpool, where they're all trying to play like high control football, and when these games get transitional in a league like the Eredivisie, then you can get through enough of those games and still win the league. I think in the Premier League, what we've seen from Erik ten Hag's Manchester United, it's just not consistent enough to really challenge at the highest level.
I would say though, right, so Ten Hag has had a lot of things to deal with on and off the pitch that might have affected how his team have played. He's had to adapt a lot because he said he didn't have the players that he wanted at the very start, but now he has a team that he's assembled for a lot of money. But he hasn't had that team for a lot of it. So the mitigating circumstances that we can maybe give him a bit of a pass for some of it, I would say injuries are a huge one because they have had loads of injuries, which might actually be partly his fault from the way that they play. It's a lot of running, the way they train. There's a lot of running in training apparently, and there's probably no coincidence that there's so many muscle injuries there. That's one of the things. But if you look at off-pitch stuff, which definitely affects things. So things as simple as changing the captaincy, taking that away from Harry Maguire, giving it to Bruno Fernandes. There's loads of different problems and issues within the squad that might develop. And then individual player things off the pitch, there's a load of them that have happened that are quite big stories. But you've got like even Harry Maguire, for example, is one. Things he's dealt with off the pitch may well have affected his form on it. Certainly some people have alluded to that in the past. And so then you've got players out of form that you can't really deal with. Rashford's out of form just now. That means kind of like being down a key player. He was our key player in Ten Hag's first season. Then you've also got things like, did Ten Hag deal with the Jadon Sancho issue very well? He's gone now. As a player who was worth a lot of money, he was very good when he signed, and now he's gone. So that's one thing. Unrest at the club's ownership, that can have an effect on players and not sure whether they're not very stable, like who's in charge, who's going to be in charge, who's going to pay me. And then you've also got just dealing with Ronaldo in general, which is a whole thing in itself, and that becomes a huge big furore. Then you've also got like the recruitment is so weird and haphazard, so then you buy a player like Antony for way more than you're supposed to, and then the pressure of living up to that impossible price tag will definitely influence or affect how you're playing. So he's had not a lot of the players he wanted to play to make it work. And then he's also had to deal with a lot of things off the pitch, which would not be ideal. And so I think maybe if he'd had all of it together without all that to deal with, it might have worked slightly better sometimes. But still, I don't think they'd be that far off where they are now, really. Would they? I don't know.
I think the big question for me is, like, what kind of football do Manchester United want to be playing?
Yeah.
And I think that regardless of the new ownership, the answer to that question has to be elite football in some way. And as we've talked about throughout this episode, elite football has to come with methods of being able to control the ball in different phases of play. And I think the big question for me about Erik ten Hag is, have we seen any evidence that his team can control the ball in every phase of play? It's been 2 years now, and I'm not really seeing it. I think this sort of transitional style with like heavy counter press, high pressing to try and win turnovers of the ball. Yeah, it worked fine last season, got them third in the league. They were miles off the title race. And this season it's dropped right off without the personnel to play it as successfully. So I think the big question for me on Ten Hag is like, fine, I understand there's mitigating circumstances, but there still has to be reasons for keeping a manager in their job. And those reasons have to be like, in the future, we believe things can change. And I'm not sure that I'm necessarily seeing that from Erik Ten Hag's Manchester United.
I was thinking the way they play with all the direct attacks, the only team I can think of maybe similar that does it in a different way would be like Atletico Madrid, but you sit deep, right, and then you have the direct attacts in that way.
Yeah.
But they play completely differently every other phase.
Simeone kind of subscribes to the idea that you can control games without the ball, right? And they've constantly had this like recurring identity crisis where they try to evolve into an elite team and dominate them with possession high up the pitch, then realise it doesn't quite work or he can't quite coach it, and then they revert back to what they've always been good at, which is kind of counter-attacking in the more traditional sense, right?
It's worth saying Liverpool as well. Like, they are a team who play quite direct. They do try and control games mainly out of possession. And I think, there are other ways of being an elite team in the Premier League than just Man City and Arsenal. And I think it's worth pointing that out. That's why in my section I wanted to talk about different ways of being able to control the ball. But for me, it's for what we see from Manchester United, I don't get a clear sense of what that control looks like in all these different phases.
So if you wanted to see what that looked like and you were in Sir Jim Ratcliffe's shoes, what would you do moving forward?
I think for me, first and foremost, it has to be centred around the director of football. They need to bring in a director of football who's going to say, this is what I think Manchester United should be trying to do on the field. Sort out your game model, talk about control. How are we going to control games? Whereabouts on the pitch are we going to try and control in possession? How are we going to...
Keep that in.
Control things better than I'm controlling things right now. How are you going to structure out of possession play as well? Once you've got those foundations in place, everything becomes so much easier, right? Because you have a list of managers who you think can do that, and then you start employing players and bringing them in who you think can play in the way that we're talking about. I think too much for Manchester United, what we've seen is you end up with pragmatism all the time because it's like we have to have results now. And so what you end up doing is just bringing in good players who end up playing like this really transitional football, and then you're like, oh, well, we're going to have to play transitional football because these are the only players that we've got. And so I think it has to be a top-down change. It has to be a sporting director has a clear idea of what is happening on the pitch, and then everything else around the club just feeding into that.
Burn it all down, start again, and be patient, basically. What would you do?
I think you could give him another year. If they're still sitting around about 6th or 7th next season, then I think you'd be fair to go with it hasn't worked, he hasn't been able to do it. It gives a bit more stability in time. By then they can put the director of football and you can start building, and maybe it turns out that what he's doing is going to work all along. And I'd love to be completely wrong about it. That'd be great, because I could learn and I could see what it is that I need to learn and be a better person, Reuben. But also, maybe they could bring in Gareth Southgate.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and Rafa Honigstein. With the latest transfer news and insight on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.